Hello, everyone.
Hi. Page 400 of In Searching of Christian Freedom. Bray is asking whether or not Jehovah's Witnesses' governing body really care about whether their disciples, their sheep, understand why they are called to obey certain policies. And he starts, I understand why those witness men feel as they do. Though the organizational policy today is considerably more technical and involved than it was back in the 1940s, I found myself in a very similar position and expected to experience imprisonment. I felt the same pressures from outside the organization and pressures from inside it. The pressures from inside it exerted greater force for me and made me determined not only to refuse to engage in armed warfare, a decision that was genuinely the result of my own conviction, one I still hold, but also to reject any type of service or work as a conscientious objector, a decision that was not genuinely my own, that is, not the product of my own thinking and conclusions. And to that paragraph he has a footnote where he says, my draft board initially refused my request for classification as a minister, turned me down on appeal, sent me my order to report for induction into the armed forces, and I would have been brought to trial and imprisonment had not appeals to state and federal authorities caused the local draft board to change its decision.
I would think that all the members of the governing body had read the articles earlier quoted from and the truthful principles they set out as regards having genuine conviction. Yet when the statements made by the branch committee members about the lack of understanding on the alternative service policy were brought to the governing body's attention, though a majority of the body favored changing the policy, I found it striking that there was an almost complete absence of dismay or even concern over the fact that men were willing to go to prison without really understanding why, that they were refusing to be in subjection to the superior authorities in this particular matter without being actually convinced that they had a scriptural basis for having taken stand against superior authorities. The evidence that group loyalty and essentially blind acceptance of organizational policy was taking the place of, perhaps in some cases even masquerading as, personal conscience, did not seem to be a matter of great concern, and never played any real role in the governing body discussion.
One governing body member even quoted approvingly the words of the Danish branch coordinator, who said with regard to placing the matter of alternative service as something to be decided by individual conscience, quote, I shudder to think of putting these young men on their own choice, end of quote. This not only betrays an enormous lack of confidence in the young men among Jehovah's Witnesses, or of confidence in the organizations having done anything to bring them out of spiritual babyhood, it also says in effect that the organization should decide for them whether they should take a course involving possible, even probable, imprisonment without their having any true choice in the matter.
If, as the Society's published articles professedly advocate, these young men had done their own thinking, had taken a stand based genuinely on personal conscience, the evidence from the branch committee members is that many, perhaps most, would have taken a course different from the policy established by the organization. Under the present arrangement, that would have brought only one consequence, being declared disassociated from the congregation. Thus, the organization apparently feels the men are not old enough or mature enough to make their own decisions, to think out their course and act according to their individual conscience before God as responsible Christians, but consider them old enough to spend part of their lives in prison without knowing why.
Youthfulness is really not at issue, however. What is true of these young witnesses is true of most adult witnesses with regard to a host of other issues: employment, various factors relating to blood, their associations, advanced education, and similar matters. It should be remembered that the branch committee men who wrote the letters that revealed the facts just described are themselves adults, not young men. Yet they themselves were committed to following the organization's directives. They were willing to apply or see applied the prescribed sanction of excommunication toward any young men in their countries who might not conform to decreed policy. And Ray has a footnote about, and it's an anecdote really, about Milton Henschel, one of the governing body who later became briefly the president of the organization after Franz's death. And it's about the issue of, I would think, as he says before, that all members of the governing body had read the articles earlier quoted. Well, this might not be the case with all, Ray says. In one governing body session, Milton Henschel mentioned that he found it difficult to keep up even with the Watchtower articles and rarely read the Awake magazine. That may well have been true of others. Well, that's a very
telling,
unbelievable thing that a governing body member would confess before the other members of the governing body.
And given that they are the governing body, I mean, they're responsible for all the people associated with the organization. You'd think they'd want to know every detail that's being presented to people.
But we often forget that they're not the writers of the articles.
Yeah.
They're just as needy when it comes to information. Maybe more needy, because most of them aren't, as he said in Crisis of Conscience, they're not writers.
But
they're not researchers.
Given the nature of the magazine's dogmatism and making policies, you'd think they'd feel an obligation to be up on it all.
We're putting a link on your screen here of a video we shot about this very issue when it comes to what Ray found out at the highest level in the Watchtower. Are the Watchtower leaders Bible students? Or are they the blind leading the blind? So we did a video on that. We'll put that on your screen. And the next segment, Confused Consciences and Confused Counsel.